Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep into the world of diplomacy. We're going to explore its history, all its different forms, and how it shapes our world.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll be going beyond that kind of stereotypical image of, ambassadors in pinstripe suits, making backroom deals.
Definitely. And we've got a really interesting set of sources to help us out. We've got a practical handbook of diplomacy, academic texts on foreign policy analysis, and even some stuff on rational choice theory.
Yeah, it's a real mix, and that kind of reflects how multifaceted diplomacy really is. And one thing that's super fascinating is that diplomacy isn't just about states anymore.
Yeah, I've been hearing that. It's cities, indigenous groups, NGOs, even celebrities getting in on the action.
Exactly. I mean, what we're going to find is that diplomacy's evolved way beyond just states, and we'll look at how its practices have been tied up with colonial governance and how that's affected, like, indigenous forms of diplomacy.
Wow, that's already a pretty thought-provoking way to look at it.
It is. Understanding that historical context is so important. And we'll also look at how things like the Haitian Revolution challenged those Eurocentric biases that were baked into traditional diplomacy.
Okay, so before we go any further, let's just define things. What exactly is diplomacy?
At its core, diplomacy is the art of managing relationships between different actors on the world stage. And as we've said, those actors aren't just countries anymore.
So it's not just ambassadors hanging out in embassies.
Not at all. We're
No.
talking about a whole spectrum of players here, from cities and indigenous peoples to NGOs, businesses, and yeah, even celebrities. They're all engaging in diplomacy these days.
It's like a giant global network of conversations and negotiations and relationships, really.
That's a great way to put it. And like any relationship, it needs communication, understanding, and a willingness to find some common ground.
Right. Okay. So if diplomacy is all about relationships, I imagine it's changed quite a bit over time. So how has the way we do diplomacy actually evolved?
You're totally right. Diplomacy's got a long and fascinating history.
Yeah.
It goes all the way back to like ancient Greece and Rome. Back then, it was often about sending envoys to deliver messages or negotiate treaties.
So very formal and ceremonial.
Exactly. Then in the Middle Ages, you see permanent embassies popping up and the whole system gets more structured, more protocols.
These are getting more organized.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this trend toward formalization kept going into the modern era. International law starts playing a bigger role in shaping diplomatic practices and institutions, like the concept of diplomatic immunity, where diplomats aren't subject to the laws of the country they're in. That got codified in international treaties.
Ah, so that's why they get away with parking tickets.
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that. Diplomatic immunity is there to make sure diplomats can do their jobs without being intimidated or interfered with by the host government. It's meant to protect them. But, like any system, it can be misused.
Right. Yeah, I get that. So we've gone from envoys on horseback to this whole complex web of international law and protocol. What are some of the different types of diplomacy we see happening today?
Oh, there's a whole bunch of diplomatic strategies out there. Each one's got its own, flavor and purpose. For example, there's public diplomacy that focuses on engaging with the public in other countries, trying to shape international opinion.
So it's about winning hearts and minds on a global scale.
Exactly. Think cultural exchanges, educational programs, even social media campaigns. It's about building relationships between people, not just governments.
It's like diplomacy goes viral.
You could say that. Then there's coercive diplomacy, which takes a more forceful approach.
Oh, this one sounds a little less friendly.
It can be. Coercive diplomacy means you use threats, maybe military action, or even limited force to back up your diplomacy. It's tricky, though, like walking a tightrope. If you push too hard, you risk making the conflict worse.
Definitely not something to use lightly. What about environmental diplomacy? That seems huge these days.
It is. With global problems like climate change becoming more and more urgent, environmental diplomacy is really key in finding solutions. It's about getting countries to work together on challenges that go beyond borders.
So cooperation on a planetary scale.
Precisely. We've also got cultural diplomacy, using exchanges in the arts, sports, culture to build relationships. And there's science diplomacy, where scientific collaborations are used to tackle shared challenges and build trust between nations.
So it's not just about politics and economics, it's about finding connections through things we all care about.
Exactly. And we can't forget indigenous diplomacy, which often has traditions and practices that are pretty different from what we usually think of as Western diplomacy.
Indigenous diplomacy. That sounds like a whole deep dive on its own.
It is. And it's a crucial part of understanding the full range of diplomatic approaches out there. We're also seeing new kinds of diplomacy, like city diplomacy. Cities are getting more and more active on the global stage, often leading the way on issues like climate change and sustainability.
Wait, cities are doing their own diplomacy now.
They are, and it's making a real difference. Cities are on the front lines of these global challenges, so they're being proactive about finding solutions and building relationships with other cities around the world.
That's pretty amazing. It sounds like the world of diplomacy is expanding in some really exciting ways.
It is, and with that expansion comes a whole new set of challenges and opportunities.
Okay, I'm ready to explore those challenges. What are some of the hurdles that diplomats face in this complex 21st century world?
Well, one of the biggest is just how complicated the issues are. Climate change, terrorism, pandemics. These are massive problems with no easy answers.
No kidding. It's not like they can just snap their fingers and make these problems disappear.
Exactly. And then you've got the rise of new technologies, which is changing how diplomacy happens. The internet, social media, artificial intelligence, these are all having a huge impact.
I bet Twitter's become a key tool in the diplomat's toolkit.
It has, for better or for worse. Diplomats have to figure out this digital world, how to use these tools well and responsibly.
And I imagine there's a lot more pressure for transparency in diplomacy now, too.
Absolutely. In a world where information spreads so fast, it's getting harder to do diplomacy behind closed doors. People want to know what's going on and they want to say in it.
So the pressure's on for diplomats to be more open and accountable.
Definitely. And all this is happening while global tensions are rising, there's economic uncertainty, and politics are getting more polarized.
It sounds like diplomats have their work cut out for them.
They do. But even with these challenges, diplomacy is still absolutely crucial for tackling global problems and building a more peaceful and sustainable future.
Okay, so in the midst of all this complexity, what are some of the key tools that a modern diplomat uses?
Well, negotiation is still at the heart of it all. It's about finding that common ground and getting to agreements that work for everyone.
So being able to listen, to understand different perspectives, and to come up with creative solutions.
Exactly. Then there's mediation, where someone neutral, a third party, helps those in conflict actually talk to each other.
Kind of like a diplomatic referee.
That's a good way to think about it.
Ah.
And then there's summitry, which is where world leaders all get together to talk about big issues and try to make some deals.
I'm picturing a massive table with tons of flags.
You're not far off. Summitry can be really helpful in breaking those deadlocks and moving forward on tough issues. Of course, it also involves a lot of pomp and circumstance.
I'm sure there's a whole team dedicated to making sure those flags are in the right place.
Absolutely. But beyond all the show, summitry is a good chance for leaders to get to know each other, which can be really important for building trust and cooperation.
Okay, so we've got negotiation, mediation, summitry, all very civilized. But I know there are also, well, more forceful tools available.
That's right. States also have things like sanctions, embargoes, and other ways to use economic pressure. It's about trying to influence another country's behavior using their economy.
So if talking doesn't work, you can always hit them where it hurts, their wallets.
Well, it's not quite that simple. Sanctions can be a double-edged sword. They might work sometimes, but they can also backfire and hurt ordinary people.
Yeah, I see how that could be a tricky situation.
It is. And that's why using those tools means you have to think carefully and really understand what the risks and benefits might be.
All right. We've covered a lot here. From how diplomacy has changed to the challenges it faces, it's clear this is a really complex field. But there's one more thing I'm curious about. This rational choice theory you mentioned. How does that fit in?
Rational choice theory is a way of understanding how people make decisions. It basically assumes that people are rational and make choices based on their own self-interest. They're trying to maximize what they gain and minimize their losses. And it's a helpful way to look at foreign policy decisions because it helps us see what motivates a country's actions.
So it's like trying to get inside the mind of a whole country.
Kind of, yeah. If we understand what drives decision makers and what limits them, we can better understand why they make the choices they do.
But I'm guessing countries don't always act perfectly rationally, right?
You're absolutely right. Rational choice theory has its limits. It doesn't always consider things like emotions, ideology, or how domestic politics play a role. And sometimes Countries just make mistakes.
So even in diplomacy, there's room for human error.
Always. And that's part of what makes it such a fascinating and unpredictable area to study.
Speaking of unpredictable, I'm dying to hear more about this pariah diplomacy you mentioned earlier. That sounds juicy.
Oh, it is. Pariah diplomacy is all about how states or groups that are considered outcasts in the world use diplomacy to get what they want and challenge the way things are. It often involves using some controversial tactics and really pushing boundaries.
So like the rebels of the diplomatic world.
You could say that. And one of the most striking examples is the Iran hostage crisis back in 1979. Iranian revolutionaries took over the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held 52 American diplomats hostage for over a year.
Wow, that's a serious diplomatic incident.
It was. It really shook things up globally. The hostage crisis showed how a state labeled a pariah could use unconventional diplomacy to challenge the norms and assert its power.
So pariah diplomacy is basically diplomacy going rogue.
In a way, yeah. It's about disrupting the status quo and using diplomacy to provoke, even to do things that a lot of the world sees as illegitimate.
That's some heavy stuff. We've covered so much ground already in this deep dive into diplomacy. Feels like we're just scratching the surface, though.
We are. Diplomacy is a huge and constantly changing field. There's always more to learn.
Well, I'm definitely ready to keep going. Let's step into the shadows a bit next and talk about secret diplomacy.
Sounds intriguing. I'm ready to dive in.
Okay, so we're back and ready to get into this world of secret diplomacy. It really does sound like something out of a spy movie.
It can be pretty intriguing, that's for sure. But secret diplomacy's been around for, like, forever, you know?
Yeah.
It's basically when you have these diplomatic negotiations, but they happen in secret, away from the public, sometimes even hidden from other governments.
So why all the secrecy? What's the point of keeping things so hush-hush?
Well, there are a few reasons. Sometimes you need that secrecy to protect sensitive information or to give negotiators some space to, try out different ideas without worrying about backlash from the public or the media.
So it's about creating a safe space for those really sensitive discussions.
Yeah, you could put it that way. It lets diplomats be more honest and flexible. But of course, like anything, it can be misused, right? Secrecy can be used to hide things from the public or to push agendas that people wouldn't be happy about.
Right, so there's that potential for things to go wrong. Are there any, famous historical examples of secret diplomacy?
Oh, tons. A classic one is the Congress of Vienna back in 1815. After Napoleon was defeated, all the big European powers got together in secret to redraw the map of Europe and set up a new balance of power.
Wow, they basically reshaped the whole political landscape in secret.
They did. And, while people often say the Congress of Vienna led to a pretty peaceful period in Europe, it was also criticized for being undemocratic and for just making the elite even more powerful.
Right, because decisions made in secret can have huge consequences.
Exactly. And the debate about whether secret diplomacy is good or bad, well, that's still going on today.
Okay, so we've got secret diplomacy happening behind closed doors. And then there's diplomatic language, which I imagine is a lot more formal.
You could definitely say that. Diplomatic language is really fascinating. It's like a carefully constructed code, It's meant to avoid misunderstandings and smooth over any potential conflicts.
It's like diplomacy's secret handshake.
Kind of, yeah. It's full of euphemisms, subtle phrases, and all these little nuances that can be tough for people outside the diplomatic world to understand.
I'm starting to see why diplomats need all that training.
It's a skill you have to develop, that's for sure. But basically, diplomatic language is about finding ways to say things without offending people or making tensions worse. It's all about being polite and respectful.
So instead of just saying, you're wrong, a diplomat might say.
Something like, we have a difference of opinion on this matter. Or, we appreciate your perspective, but we see things a bit differently.
Very diplomatic. I'm hearing a lot of passive voice in there.
You're right. The passive voice is like a staple of diplomatic language. You can say things without pointing fingers or taking direct responsibility.
Clever. So diplomatic language is about being polite even when you disagree.
Exactly. It's about keeping things respectful, even when things get tough. But, there are times when even the most carefully chosen words just aren't enough.
And that's when things escalate, right? What happens when diplomacy fails and conflict breaks out?
Well, that's when crisis diplomacy comes into play. It's about dealing with those really high-stakes situations where things could easily get out of control, escalate into war.
Crisis diplomacy. That sounds pretty intense.
It can be. It often involves a lot of intense negotiations, making decisions quickly, and even taking risks. The stakes are high, there's a ton of pressure, and if you fail, well, the consequences can be huge.
I bet diplomats working in those situations don't get much sleep.
They don't. It's a really demanding job, but it's so important. Crisis diplomats are often the ones trying to keep things from turning into war.
That's a big responsibility. What kind of tools did they use to try and de-escalate those situations?
A lot of same tools as regular diplomacy, just with a lot more urgency. Negotiation is still key, but everything happens much faster. Mediation can be helpful, especially if there's someone both sides trust who can, like, bridge the gap.
And does coercive diplomacy ever come into play in those situations?
It can, but it's a risky move. If you start throwing around military threats or actually use force during a crisis, well, it can make things a lot worse really fast.
So it's like a last resort.
Exactly. Crisis diplomacy is all about finding that balance, putting on the pressure without pushing things over the edge.
So you have to navigate all those tricky situations and hopefully avoid disaster. But even if you manage to prevent a major crisis, there's still the challenge of, well, rebuilding things afterward.
That's very true. And that's where post-conflict diplomacy comes in.
Post-conflict diplomacy. So it's like the cleanup crew for the diplomatic world.
That's one way to think about it. Post-conflict diplomacy is about helping countries that have gone through a conflict to heal, to rebuild, and to try and create a lasting peace.
I can imagine that's a really long and difficult process.
It is. It often means dealing with things like reconciliation, justice, and economic development.
Yeah.
It can take years, even decades, to rebuild that trust and get people cooperating again.
So it's not just about signing a peace treaty and calling it a day.
Definitely not. Post-conflict diplomacy is about addressing those root causes of the conflict, those underlying issues, and trying to create the right environment for peace to last.
Okay, so we have crisis diplomacy for those really tense moments, and then post-conflict diplomacy to put things back together afterward. But in our world, which is so interconnected, I'm guessing we need like a more global approach to diplomacy.
You're right on the mark.
Hmm.
And that's where multilateral diplomacy comes in. It's about getting lots of different countries to work together, tackling those shared challenges and working toward common goals.
So instead of just two countries trying to sort things out, you have a whole room full of diplomats.
Exactly. Multilateral diplomacy often happens in these international organizations like the UN, where countries can talk, negotiate agreements, and coordinate what they're doing.
So the UN is kind of like a giant diplomacy hub.
You could say that. It's a platform for countries to connect on all sorts of issues like security, development, human rights, global health, all of it.
Okay, so multilateral diplomacy is all about cooperation and working together. But I imagine it's not always easy to get everyone to agree, right?
It's true. Multilateral diplomacy can be really complex. It needs compromise, consensus building, and a willingness to work together even when there are differences of opinion.
I bet there's a lot of persuasion happening behind the scenes.
There's definitely a lot of negotiating going on, but when multilateral diplomacy works, it can be a powerful force for good in the world.
Okay, so we've explored this secret diplomacy, crisis diplomacy, and how those multilateral negotiations work. But there's another part of diplomacy I want to talk about, one that often gets overlooked.
I think I know where you're going with this. You're talking about small state diplomacy.
That's it. It doesn't sound quite as exciting as all the big summits and international agreements, does it?
You're right, it doesn't always get the same attention. But small state diplomacy is incredibly important. These countries often face unique challenges, and they have to be really smart about how they use their resources to achieve their goals and foreign policy.
So it's like diplomacy on a budget.
In a way, yeah. A lot of small states just don't have the money to have embassies everywhere or launch these big public diplomacy campaigns, so they have to think outside the box.
What are some of the ways they, make the most of their diplomatic efforts?
One thing they often do is focus on specific areas where they have a lot of knowledge or a particular interest. Like a small island nation might become a leader in pushing for action on climate change.
That makes sense. They're the ones who are really feeling the effects firsthand.
Exactly. Small states can also use their membership in those international organizations to have more influence. They can team up with other countries that have similar interests and be strategic about how they use their votes.
So it's like diplomacy by building coalitions.
You got it. Small states have to be really savvy and strategic in how they play the game of diplomacy.
Okay, so small state diplomacy. They may be the underdogs, but they shouldn't be underestimated.
Absolutely. They play a vital role and often do a lot more than you'd think on the world stage. And speaking of punching above their weight, let's talk about a newer player in the diplomacy game. Digital diplomacy.
Ah, yes, digital diplomacy. It sounds so futuristic.
It's relatively new, that's true, but it's already changing how diplomacy is done. Digital diplomacy is basically using all that digital technology like social media, websites, and apps to achieve diplomatic goals.
So instead of sending telegrams, diplomats are tweeting now.
They are, and they're using all sorts of other digital tools to connect with people, share information, and build those relationships.
I can see how social media would be a powerful tool for diplomacy. You can reach so many people instantly.
Exactly, and you can go around those traditional media outlets and speak directly to people.
It's like diplomacy going viral again.
In a way, yeah. Digital diplomacy has the potential to make diplomacy more democratic, more accessible to everyday people.
But I'm guessing there are some downsides to digital diplomacy too.
Definitely. One of the biggest is how easily misinformation and propaganda can spread online. Then there's the whole issue of managing your online reputation and avoiding any diplomatic blunders.
Right, because once something's online, it's out there forever.
Exactly. So digital diplomats have to be very careful and strategic in how they use these tools.
So digital diplomacy, it's a powerful new tool, but one that needs to be used carefully.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like any tool, it can be used for good or bad. It's really up to diplomats to use it responsibly.
Okay, so digital diplomacy is definitely shaking things up. But there's one more area I want to touch on, and it's one that people often debate.
You're talking about coercive diplomacy.
That's the one. It seems a bit strange, Isn't diplomacy all about peace and cooperation?
It is, ideally. But sometimes you need some leverage to make diplomacy work. Coercive diplomacy is basically using threats or limited force to try to change another country's behavior.
So it's like diplomacy with a stick.
You could say that. The stick could be economic sanctions, a military buildup, or even a limited military strike. The point is to show you're serious and that there will be consequences if they don't change course.
I can see how that might work, but it also seems kind of risky. Isn't there a chance of just making the conflict worse?
There absolutely is. Coercive diplomacy is a high-stakes game. If you miscalculate your threats, you could easily escalate the situation.
So it's a bit like playing poker, but with nuclear weapons.
It's a good analogy. The stakes are high, and if you miscalculate, well, it can be disastrous.
Okay, so coercive diplomacy, it's controversial, but sometimes it's necessary in this complicated world of international relations.
Right, it's not something to be used lightly.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's the only way to get the other side's attention and bring them to the table to negotiate.
We've talked about so much already, from the history of diplomacy to all the different tools and strategies, but it feels like we're missing something, that human element. How do things like culture and religion actually impact diplomacy?
Yeah, you're totally right. Those are like crucial factors that often don't get enough attention. You can have the best diplomatic strategy in the world, but if you're not culturally sensitive, things can go wrong really fast.
Right.
Think about it. Language barriers, different social norms, religious beliefs. Those things can make or break a negotiation or even a whole relationship between countries.
For sure, it's like you could accidentally offend someone without even realizing it.
Exactly. Even something as simple as like a handshake, or a pat on the back can mean totally different things in different cultures. There's that famous story about a U.S. president who greeted a Japanese emperor with a big pat on the back, which was like a huge no-no in Japan.
Oh, I bet that didn't go over well.
It didn't. It caused a minor diplomatic incident. So, diplomats have to be super aware of these cultural differences. It's more than just learning a few phrases in another language.
It's about really understanding that deeper cultural context.
Right, exactly. They need to understand the history, the values, the beliefs of the people they're working with. And that takes time, study, and a willingness to, really immerse yourself in another culture.
What about religion? What role does that play in diplomacy? That seems especially complicated.
It is. Religion can be a really powerful force in international relations. It can be a good thing or a bad thing. Sometimes it's a source of shared values and helps to build bridges between cultures. There are tons of examples of religious leaders and organizations doing amazing work in peace building and, helping to resolve conflicts.
Right, like the Quakers, they have a long history of peace activism.
Exactly. But, religion can also be a source of division and conflict. And when religious beliefs get mixed up with politics, things can get really messy really fast.
Yeah, we've definitely seen how that can happen.
Unfortunately, yes. So diplomats need to understand the religious landscape in the countries they're working with. They need to be sensitive to different faiths and avoid doing anything that might be seen as disrespectful or offensive.
Right, so it's about finding that balance, respecting people's beliefs, but not letting those beliefs, dictate foreign policy.
It's a tough balance, for sure. And it requires diplomats to be incredibly knowledgeable and skilled. They need to be able to navigate all those complexities with sensitivity and wisdom.
This whole deep dive has really shown me how much more there is to diplomacy than I ever thought. It's so much more than just fancy dinners and signing treaties.
Absolutely. It's about understanding people, building relationships, figuring out how to work with those cultural differences, and ultimately, finding ways to cooperate and solve problems together.
Exactly. And as our world becomes even more connected and complex, those skills are going to be more important than ever.
I couldn't agree more.
Hmm.
We need good diplomats now more than ever to help us deal with global challenges, to connect with different cultures and to create a future that's more peaceful and sustainable for everyone.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of diplomacy, what's one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the most important thing to remember is that diplomacy is it's a process. It's dynamic. It's always changing. It's not just something that happens in stuffy rooms with all those protocols. It's happening everywhere, all the time. It's shaping how individuals, communities, and whole nations relate to each other. And it's constantly evolving to meet new challenges and opportunities.
That's a great point. It makes me think, with all the new technologies, the growing power of groups that aren't states, and just how complicated global issues are becoming. What's next for diplomacy? What new forms will it take? What new tools will we see? Those are questions I think we all need to be thinking about as we move into the 21st century.
Absolutely. The future of diplomacy is wide open. It's up to all of us to really engage with those questions and make sure that future works for everyone.